We're going to switch gears a little bit here, and we're going to step down off the deck of the Starship Enterprise here, and get back into maybe Pirates of the Caribbean, and talk a little bit more about an industry that's not quite so glamorous, but nevertheless does produce a lot of economic impact for our area, and we're going to see that in just a minute. I did want to pick up on one thing that Walter did say, though, and that was the vision that our forefathers here in Houston had in 1836 when the Allen brothers came here from New York. Most historians, and I read a lot of Texas history, and I love Texas history, and I tend to believe what they have to say. If it hadn't been for the Allen brothers and a lot of other men and women that were here at that time and had the vision that they had to recognize that Houston would never be, I mean, we're really the city and the port that probably never should have happened. And the Allen brothers had the vision to recognize that Buffalo Bayou, what is today known as the Houston Ship Channel, without cleaning that bayou out and dredging that and getting to the ocean, that Houston would never be able to achieve its potential. So every one of us sitting in here today, and it's a citizen of this city and enjoying the benefits of the great economic boom that this city has enjoyed over the years, owe a debt of gratitude to those people that had that kind of vision. How many people here have been to the Port of Houston, actually? How many? Wow, really? That many? Well, that's a surprise. I usually don't get those many hands, and that's a lot of times I'm talking to people in the industry, and a lot of them haven't even been to the Port of Houston. So that's good. First of all, I do want to thank the Port of Houston Authority, and let me make something clear. I don't work for the Port Authority. Sometimes I feel like I do, but we, Ron and I and our company, we work very, very closely with the Port Authority, and this presentation is going to be about the port and the companies like ours that drive the business through the Port Authority. So the numbers and the impact, economic numbers that you see are going to be accumulation of all those businesses. I want to recognize Keith Maselli, who is here from the Trade Development Group with the Port Authority. I'm sure Keith will keep me in line if I get too far astray here. So with that, we're going to talk about the benefit that the port brings here. And I need to clarify one thing real quick before we get started. You'll notice that this says Port of Houston Authority, and then we talk about the Port of Houston. In reality, the numbers that we're going to talk about represent the greater body of the Port of Houston, which represents approximately 150 plus or minus private companies that make up the Houston Ship Channel Port Complex. The Port of Houston Authority is really just one of those companies and is a separate operating entity all to itself. The Port Authority was mandated by the Texas legislature. Keith, you remember when? It's been a long time ago. I forgot the date. But anyway, to more or less be the governing body, if you will, for the port. The Port Authority has certain responsibilities to be the big brother or to watch over the port activities. It involves things like environmental stewardship. The port's responsible for working with the EPA to make sure that we do a good job of that. And the port, by the way, has done an extremely good job of doing that. They're responsible for working with the pilots to make sure that we have proper navigation on the ship channel. They're responsible for working with the U.S. Coast Guard in providing security to the greater Houston Ship Channel. In fact, many of you may have now heard about an organization called the Houston Ship Channel Security District, which is a one-of-a-kind, just recently created body that has responsibility for enacting and providing security for overall security of the port. And the port was very instrumental in helping get that done, by the way. And they have a responsibility for rights of way, for pipelines and things like that. So that's kind of the differentiation here. So going forward now, we're going to talk about, if you see Port of Houston Authority in these numbers, they really represent what is really the Port of Houston in its total. The Port of Houston, as you see, has two container terminals, the two flagship terminals, which we'll talk more about here in just a few minutes, and they operate 6 other terminals. And again, out of that represents about 150 terminals. Of that total, the Port Authority represents something like maybe 15% of the total tonnage and numbers that you're going to see here. The port is the largest U.S. port by foreign tonnage. That means obviously cargo going to and from a foreign port. Largest port in North America for break bulk and project cargo. Now that means, for those of you not in the shipping business, break bulk project is cargo that doesn't fit into a standard 20-foot or 40-foot container. And that can be anything, what we call out of gauge or overweight. It just doesn't go into a container. Or project cargo is also a name that's used which also applies to break bulk, but it's usually associated with a massive project, let's say an oil field project that maybe Halliburton's doing to Saudi. And everything that's moving on that project is called project cargo for that, and it'll have a name, and that's what that means there. Largest port for steel. This should be of no surprise to anybody. Largest port for petroleum. The tonnage that the Port Authority handles, by far and away, the biggest tonnage of that number is the liquid petroleum that comes in and out of the port in bulk tankers. We're the 7th largest port in North America by TEU throughput, and TEU throughput means 20-foot equivalent unit. Everything in international shipping, in container shipping, is measured by that TEU number. So when you hear TEU, they're talking about a 20-foot container. And we're the 15th largest port in the world by tonnage. 2010 results, the port moved 220 million tons of cargo, 1.8 million 20-foot containers, and this is a huge number here. I mean, look at this, 68%, almost 70% of all the cargo that comes into the U.S. Gulf, all the way from Tampa all the way down to Brownsville, comes to Houston, Texas. Just under 8,000 vessel calls last year. Now, this is the numbers that really should get your attention. And this is what you all came here, I think, mostly to see today, and then see where these numbers are going to go after we finish this presentation. Martin & Associates are the ones that do this study for the port. They're a worldwide, well-recognized port consulting company. They do work for the Port of Rotterdam and a number of large ports around the world in putting together these economic impact studies for ports. You can read the numbers, 285 billion of economic activity in the U.S., 118 billion of that stays in the state of Texas. The Port Authority, and when I say the Port Authority and the Port of Houston, now we're talking about 1.5 million jobs. That means the Port Authority people, direct jobs. That means people like me and Ron that go to work every day in that business, that put business through the port. It means people like Sam Diaz, who I saw here somewhere earlier. I know Sam's here somewhere. Sam is a big shipper through the Port of Houston, so he would be in that number. That's the kind of numbers that we're talking about. So it has a huge reach all through the city and all through the region. 785,000 of those jobs are jobs here in Texas. Let me compare that real quick. And this is, I think you'll find interesting because Walter referred to a couple of things, and I had to write these down on a piece of paper because I couldn't remember them otherwise. I want to give you some comparisons. Give you some comparisons of how that works. Pardon me while I put my glasses on real quick. Go back to the economic activity and the jobs created. Let's take a look at some of the other industries that we just heard about. Walter, in fact, mentioned a couple of them. The medical center, world-renowned medical center, right? 140,000 jobs and roughly $6 billion in economic impact. And look what the port does. NASA, you talked a little bit about NASA, okay? NASA is responsible for roughly 16,000 jobs and about 1.5 billion in economic impact in the area. Houston Airport System, for example, that would be George Bush, Hobby, and Ellington Field. They account for approximately 90,000 jobs and about 8 billion in economic activity. But then here comes the big guy. The whole reason almost the whole reason from 1836, 1839 to 1901 into the mid-1930s after Spindletop and a huge oil boom that hit East Texas, it made Houston the nation's #1 leader in energy. And I'm talking about petrochemical, not getting into wind and all that other stuff. This is the big number. They represent about 2.2 million jobs and something in the neighborhood of like 82,000 billion dollars in economic activity. So, without question, the energy sector is certainly the big driver. It still is, probably always will be. But you can see that the port comes in probably at a pretty good second in all of the companies that we've talked about. You mentioned technology. I think you mentioned, what, $4 billion in activity, something like that?
Just software.
Just software, okay. So that's obviously in there as well. Anyway, so that gives you a little bit of an idea of how the port stacks up. And for those of you who don't pay much attention to the port, you don't hear much about it. I mean, you see an ad for it every now and then, but mostly it just kind of that's over there somewhere we don't know much about. But it has a huge impact on every one of us in this room. You can see the income taxes. I'm not going to read all of that. You can see that for yourself. 2010, the port made $212 million in capital project investment, and scheduled through 2013, they're going to do $855 million. I'm not going to spend time on these. There are a lot of numbers there. We'll get lost in the weeds if we go through all of that. Those are just some statistics about Barber's Cut, which is the first container terminal that the port, or the first modern container terminal. They did handle containers at the turning basin in the early days, but this was the first really modern container terminal that was built. It was built and started in 1970, I believe completed in 1977. And that, of course, is down at Morgan's Point and LaPorte. Bayport, this is the new flagship container terminal that was built primarily for the expected explosion of Asian cargo that we expect to get here with the completion of the widening of the Panama Canal project in 2014. Everything wrapped around this port is all about drawing that cargo here, and we'll talk some more about that and why that's so important. Again, I won't go into all of the details, but to go down to, it's not completed yet, but at build out, Bayport will add about another 1.4 million container capacity, or a total of 2.3 million TEUs. Last year, if you heard, you noticed that the port did total at 1.8 million 20-foot containers. When Barber's Cut is fully built out, 2017, the port expects to do 4 million plus 20-foot containers, almost double of what they're doing today. So think about that. I mean, that is just huge. You think those numbers are big? Wait till you see them next time. So that's the Bayport terminal. I'm not going to spend time on the details of the container terminals themselves. That's not relevant. Here's what you want to pay attention to. All of this talk that you hear in talk in the papers about the Panama Canal. Well, why is the Panama Canal so important? Or I should say the widening of the Panama Canal. Well, with the explosion of the Asian cargo, and make no mistake about it, in global trade today, and has been for several years, and is forecast at least for the next several years, Asia, driven primarily by China, is going to be the primary driving force behind global trade. That's not going to change. And to accommodate all that business, ship owners have gone out and leased and built much larger vessels than we're used to seeing. I mean, today, the Port Authority, a vessel at the Port Authority today is in the 4,000 maybe to 5,000 TEU range. We're talking about ships now that are going to be as much as 11,000 to 13,000 TEUs. Think about that. Those are ships that are in excess of 1,200 feet long, roughly 200 feet wide, carry in excess of 45 to 46 foot of draft. That's why it was so important that the canal get this widening project and accommodate these bigger vessels, because today the biggest ship that can go through the canal is roughly a 5,000 container equivalent vessel. And even that can't get through with 5,000 containers if it's fully loaded, because the canal today is only 39 foot of draft. They can only come through with about 3,800 TEUs if the ship is fully loaded. So you lose a lot of capacity because of that. So that's why the canal is so important to get that finished, and get it finished in a hurry, because we, Houston and the Gulf and other ports as well, want to be able to be the recipient of this explosion of Asian cargo that's going to be coming from Asia. And if our ports aren't big enough, and if the canal's not big enough to handle them, then we lose those efficiencies, those economies of scale that the bigger ships bring. They'll go someplace else. Today, your large vessels today are in the trade. If they're 8,000 or above TEUs today, most of those vessels, there's about 300 of those ships in service today. About 200 of those out of that 300 all go only from Asia to Europe, and back to Asia and back to Europe. That's the biggest trade lane in the world. About 30 or 40 of the remainder are in the Trans-Pacific, 8,000 TEUs or under, and the others are just kind of scattered around. So that's why it's important that this canal get completed. That's why it's important for Bayport to get completed, so that we get the economies and the efficiencies that those larger ships are going to bring with all the trade that's going to be coming here. You'll see that 20% of Houston's containerized cargo today already comes through the Panama Canal. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And when the canal is finished, it's expected to jump it up by another 7 to 9% by 2015. Houston is certainly ideally positioned to capture a larger position of that. 32% of the total import traffic comes from Asia already. Our dominant petrochemical position here will play, certainly will play a natural role in continuing to, in that market. And then, as I just discussed a little bit, when the Panama Canal opens in 2014, it's what we call post-Panamax ships or PPX ships. They're the ones that'll be allowed to bring and come into the port and bring us those larger vessels and certainly a lot more cargo. Why Houston? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Say Houston is a safe harbor. This is very important. The Journal of Commerce about 2 or 3 years ago did a great article on the Port Authority, and they came up with 3 things that described the Port of Houston and why the Port of Houston was so successful. They called it the 3 L's. It was location, land, and labor. And those 3 things are wrapped up in this whole slide here. Location being that we are basically in the middle of the United States. We're right equidistance to the East Coast as we are to the West Coast, same amount of distance up to Canada, and we've got Europe, and we got we've got Mexico and Central America in our backyard, so ideally positioned. Land, we got lots of land. We got lots of land around a major growing container port. Unlike the West Coast, unlike the East Coast, where land is already pretty much booked up, and if you can find it, it's so expensive you can't build a container terminal on it anyway. So we have land that's available. It may be expensive. It's expensive to me if I want to go buy it, but if you're a big container operator or developer, land in Houston is still very, very, very attractive. And finally, the labor. We have an incredible labor situation in Houston. I think the last strike that we had here in Houston with the ILA, I think was in 1968, if I remember right. We have an incredibly good working relationship with the ILA here in Houston, Texas, and that's one reason why Houston has done so good.